Ladies and gentlemen, in the time it takes for a standard office shift, the United States Navy erased half of a sovereign nation's naval fleet from the face of the earth. Just think about your typical Monday morning. You clock in at 9, check your emails, grab a coffee, and maybe settle into another meeting. But by the time you're heading out for your afternoon break, the entire geopolitical landscape of the Middle East has been permanently altered. This was not a protracted campaign of attrition. No, it wasn't a months-long siege. It was a 480-minute masterclass in naval dominance, known as Operation Praying Mantis. You see, on April 18, 1988, the Persian Gulf was a total powder keg. The Iran-Iraq War had devolved into a chaotic tanker war, where commercial vessels were being targeted to choke off the world's oil supply. For working professionals across the globe, the stakes were personal. I mean, we're talking about a total energy crisis that threatened to grind the global economy to a halt. The United States had reached its breaking point. The world's most powerful navy was no longer there just to observe. They were there to dismantle. But why this specific day? Why did the American machine decide to unleash total devastation before the sun had even set? Well, the answer lay at the bottom of the Gulf, inside the shattered hull of the USS Samuel B. Roberts. 4 days earlier, this billion-dollar guided missile frigate had struck an Iranian mine in what was supposed to be international waters. The explosion was so violent it nearly snapped the ship in two, wounding 10 sailors and sending a clear message of defiance to Washington. To President Ronald Reagan and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Sammy B wasn't just a ship, it was a red line. The response wouldn't be a diplomatic letter or a slap in the wrist. It would be a surgical removal of Iran's ability to project power at sea. As the clocks began to tick on that fateful April morning, the Iranians had absolutely no idea that their navy was about to face a force of nature. This was the beginning of the largest surface engagement for the U.S. Navy since World War II. And by the end of the shift, there would be nothing but burning wreckage and a terrifying realization of what happens when a superpower stops holding back. Ladies and gentlemen, to truly understand the firestorm that was about to erupt, you see, we have to look at the water. In the mid-1980s, the Persian Gulf was no longer a symbol of global commerce. No, but the most terrifying threat wasn't the missile you could see on a radar screen. It was the silent killer lurking just beneath the waves. On April 14, 1988, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, a guided missile frigate known to her crew simply as the Sammy B, was finishing an escort mission. She was a state-of-the-art machine, a true masterpiece of American naval engineering. But as she navigated the Central Gulf, her lookout spotted something bobbing in the water, then another. They were black, spiked, and rusted, Iranian M08 contact mines. Captain Paul Rinn ordered the ship to back clear, trying to retrace their wake to safety, but the trap was already set. At 4:51 p.m., the water beneath the Sammy B erupted in a colossal pillar of white foam and black smoke. The explosion was catastrophic. A 5-foot hole was punched into the hull, and the engine room flooded instantly. The force of the blast was so violent it actually lifted the 4,000-ton frigate out of the water, cracking her keel, literally snapping the ship's spine. In the darkness of the lower decks, sailors fought through fire and rising seawater, performing absolute miracles of damage control, just to keep the vessel from breaking in two. This wasn't an accidental collision or some stray shot. This was a targeted, covert act of war. The United States now had a choice to make. Firmly, they had the evidence, serial numbers on nearby floating mines that matched Iranian stockpiles. The official lie of a neutral Gulf had been vaporized in that explosion. Ladies and gentlemen, the Reagan administration now faced a terrifying question. How do you respond to an enemy that strikes from the shadows of the sea? Authoritatively, the answer would not be a diplomatic protest. Powerfully, it would be a display of naval supremacy that the world had not seen in decades. Mysteriously, as the carrier groups began to move into position, one question remained. Just how far was Iran willing to go before the entire region went up in flames? Ladies and gentlemen, the clock struck 8 a.m. on April 18th, 1988. You see, this was no longer a game of shadows or maritime hide and seek. Powerfully, the United States Navy was about to execute a masterpiece of integrated warfare under the codename Operation Praying Mantis. Firmly, this wasn't merely a retaliatory strike, right? It was a paradigm shift. Authoritatively, the Americans weren't just looking for an eye for an eye. No, they were looking to dismantle the very backbone of Iranian naval command. The strategy, it was as elegant as it was devastating. Tactically, the U.S. deployed The Iranians didn't blink. They manned their 23mm anti-aircraft guns and opened fire on the most sophisticated navy on the planet. It was a fatal mistake. The Morel and the guided missile destroyer USS Lynd McCormick responded with a relentless barrage of 5-inch shells. Within minutes, the platform was a skeleton of twisted, burning steel. U.S. Marines then fast-roped onto the wreckage, not just to finish the job, but to seize intelligence documents that would expose the entire Iranian mining network. Simultaneously, further east, SAG Charlie was raining fire on the Siri platform. This was the proportional response doctrine in its purest form. The U.S. was meticulously stripping away Iran's ability to see, to breathe, and to strike in the Gulf. But there was a deeper layer to this tactical brilliance. By systematically erasing these outposts, the U.S. Navy was effectively kicking a hornet's nest. They weren't just destroying infrastructure, you see. They were luring the Iranian Navy into a carefully prepared kill zone. The strategic trap was set. The American carrier groups were loitering just over the horizon, their radar screens humming with anticipation. The silence following the destruction of the platforms was deafening. The Iranian commanders now faced a choice that would define the fate of their nation's military pride. Would they remain in their harbors and watch their power evaporate, or would they commit their fleet to the open sea and sail directly into the teeth of the American dragon? Ladies and gentlemen, the moment of decision had arrived. High noon in the Persian Gulf, and the Iranian Navy chose defiance over survival. Emerging from the heat haze, the frigate Sahand, the crown jewel of their fleet, began to close the distance. It was a bold move, right? Born of either immense courage or a fatal misunderstanding of the monster they were actually facing. But modern warfare, well, it's rarely a fair fight. For the crew of the Sahand, the enemy wasn't a ship on the horizon, it was a series of digital ghosts on a radar screen miles away. From the deck of the USS Enterprise, A-6 intruder attack jets roared into the sky, carrying a payload designed for one thing: total annihilation. The Sahand opened fire first, a desperate volley of anti-aircraft rounds that actually did little more than punch holes in the blue sky. The American response was surgical. A harpoon missile, skimming just above the waves at near-sonic speeds, slammed into the Sahand's hull with the force of a falling skyscraper. Within seconds, laser-guided bombs rained from the clouds, finding their marks with terrifying efficiency. Somberly, the frigate didn't just burn, it disintegrated. It became a floating funeral pyre, a steel tomb for those who dared to challenge the reach of a superpower. But the carnage was only half complete. Seeing the Sahand's fate, its sister ship, the Sabalan, a vessel notorious for its brutal raids on civilian tankers, stepped into the fray. The tactical synchronization was flawless. It was a masterclass in the theater of war. Carrier air wings and surface destroyers operated as a single lethal organism, leaving the Iranian commanders with zero tactical options. They were fighting a ghost they couldn't see, and a power they couldn't hope to match. By sunset, the once defiant fleet was reduced to slick oil and twisted metal bobbing in the tide. The pride of the Iranian Navy had been neutralized in a matter of hours. Yet, as the smoke cleared and the American ships turned back toward the horizon, a new question began to circulate through the halls of the Pentagon. The physical battle was won, but the geopolitical shockwaves were only just beginning to ripple outward. And as it turns out, the most dangerous part of the day wasn't the missiles that hit their targets. It was the one message that never made it to the shore. Ladies and gentlemen, the smoke rising from the Sahand and the Joshan was more than just the end of a naval engagement. It was, quite literally, the funeral pyre of an entire regional strategy. For the Iranian leadership, you see, the realization was cold and immediate. Their attempt to strangle the world's oil supply had been met with a level of kinetic violence they simply, and I mean simply, were not prepared to match. Within months of this devastating encounter, the defiant rhetoric in Tehran began to shift.